The massive alien ships hung in space like dark metal mountains, their hulls gleaming under the distant sun's light. Commander Kim Hannah pressed her face against the cold glass of Luna Station's observation deck, watching the enemy fleet with growing dread. The Valak Consortium had arrived 3 days ago, and their message was crystal clear. 72 hours to surrender, or Earth dies, Captain Park Jin-ho said quietly, standing beside her. His voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too many battles, but none like this. The translation device in his hand kept repeating the alien ultimatum in perfect Korean, English, and dozens of other Earth languages. Kim Hannah had fought pirates in the asteroid belt and rebels on Mars, but she had never faced anything like this. The Velok fleet stretched across the solar system like a net, blocking every escape route. Their siege platforms were each the size of a small city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets in half. How many ships? She asked, though she already knew the answer would not bring comfort. Over 300 major vessels, Jin-ho replied, checking his datapad. Intelligence says they've used this same strategy on 47 other worlds. Complete isolation first, then the ultimatum, then. He did not need to finish the sentence. The Velok were efficient conquerors. They surrounded a world, cut off all communications with the outside galaxy, and gave the population exactly 72 hours to decide. Submit and become slaves, or refuse and watch their planet burn from orbit. It was a simple choice that had worked every time, but Earth's military leaders were not panicking, at least not completely. Kim Hannah had received strange orders from High Command just hours before the communication blackout. Evacuation plans were already in motion, moving civilians to underground shelters and orbital stations. Yet there was something else. Something the brass was not telling the regular officers. On the enemy flagship, Admiral Vekver studied the blue-green planet through his command chamber's massive viewing screen. Earth looked peaceful from this distance, its white clouds swirling lazily over green continents and blue oceans. It would almost be a shame to destroy such a beautiful world, but business was business. Status report, he commanded, his forearms gesturing at his subordinates. All siege platforms are in position, replied his tactical officer. Communication jammers are active. No signals are leaving or entering the system. The humans are completely isolated. Vekver nodded, with satisfaction. The humans had put up no resistance, launched no desperate attacks, sent no negotiation attempts. They were behaving exactly like every other species the consortium had conquered. Fear made intelligent, beings predictable. Sir, another officer spoke up. Our deep space sensors are detecting some unusual energy readings from the outer system, near what the humans call the Kuiper Belt. Research stations, Vekver said dismissively. We know about their scientific outposts. Let them conduct their pointless experiments. In 68 hours, it will not matter. Far beyond Pluto's orbit, in the cold darkness, where sunlight barely reached, Research Station Erebus drifted in silence. The station looked abandoned from the outside, its lights dimmed, its communication arrays offline. But inside, Dr. Lee Minho was very much awake and very busy. The encrypted message from Earth. Command had been brief, but clear. Protocol nightmare, authorization granted. Those 4 words carried more weight than any weapon in humanity's arsenal. Lee had been waiting for this message for 15 years, hoping he would never receive it. He walked through the station's quiet corridors, past laboratories filled with equipment that most scientists could only dream of. The research here was so classified that even the station's existence was known to fewer than 100 people on Earth. What they studied here was not physics or chemistry or biology in any conventional sense. The elevator descended deep into the station's core, past levels marked with warnings in a dozen languages. Lee's security clearance was one of only 5 in existence. When the elevator stopped, he stepped into a chamber that defied every law of physics he had learned in university The containment cells lined the walls like windows into nightmare. Behind each barrier of force fields and exotic matter, something moved in the darkness. These were not aliens in any sense that most humans would understand. They were older than star formation, more ancient than galaxies. Things that had existed in the void between worlds since before the universe learned how to make light. Lee had spent his career studying them, trying to understand beings that existed, partially outside normal reality. They fed on energy, but not just any energy. They hungered for the complex electromagnetic patterns that only advanced civilizations could produce. The brighter the technology, the more delicious the meal. Humanity had found them by accident during the first deep space exploration missions beyond the galaxy's edge. The creatures had been drifting in the intergalactic void, apparently sleeping, waiting for something. When human ships approached, they had awakened and communicated in ways that bypassed language entirely. Speaking directly to human minds, the message had been simple. They were hungry, and they had been waiting a very long time for prey, worthy of their attention. Humanity had managed to capture several specimens, bringing them back for study while keeping their existence absolutely secret. Now, as the Velic fleet blazed like beacon fires across the solar system, Lee prepared to wake the sleepers and point them toward the largest feast they had sensed in millions of years. Dr. Lee. Minho's hands shook as he reached for the control panel. The buttons glowed soft blue in the dim light of the containment chamber, each one representing a decision that could change the fate of the galaxy. Behind him, 3 other scientists watched in tense silence, their faces pale under the emergency lighting. "Are you sure about this?" whispered Dr. Choi Yuna, her fingers hovering over her monitoring equipment. She had worked with these creatures for 8 years, studying them, feeding them small amounts of energy to keep them alive, but she had never seen them truly awake. "Earth Command gave the order," Lee replied, his voice barely steady. "Protocol Nightmare is active. We have no choice." Dr. Bae Gunho checked his instruments one more time. "All safety systems are online. The psychic dampeners are at maximum power. But once we wake them up..." He did not finish the sentence. They all knew what could happen if the containment failed. The creatures in the cells were called Void Stalkers by the research team. Though the beings had never given humanity their real name, they had been discovered 15 years ago when the deep space exploration ship Aurora had ventured beyond the edge of the Milky Way galaxy. The crew found them drifting in the empty darkness between star systems, apparently sleeping. At first, the explorers thought they had found some kind of space debris, or perhaps dead alien technology. The objects were roughly the size of a small building, dark and shapeless, absorbing all light that touched them. But when the Aurora's sensors scanned them, the readings made no sense. The objects existed in normal space, but also seemed to stretch into dimensions that human science could not measure. Then one of them woke up. The Aurora's crew barely escaped with their lives, but not before the creature had spoken to them. Not with words or sounds, but by touching their minds directly. The message was simple and terrifying. It was hungry, and it had been waiting a very long time for something interesting to eat. Somehow, the crew managed to capture 3 of the sleeping creatures and bring them back to human space. The government immediately classified the discovery at the highest levels. Only a handful of people knew the truth about what slept in the research stations hidden in the outer solar system. Now, Dr. Songhound monitored the energy readings as Lee began the awakening sequence. "Power levels are climbing," she reported. "The containment field is holding, but barely. Whatever these things are, they're drawing energy from somewhere we can't detect." Lee pressed the first button, and the chamber filled with a low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Inside Containment Bay 7, something began to move. The darkness shifted and twisted, growing denser in some places, and thinner in others. It was like watching smoke, except smoke did not bend space around itself. "Neural activity detected," Choi said, her voice tight with concentration. It's ... massive. The readings are off our charts, and it's already scanning the local area. The creature was waking up, and as it did, it immediately began searching for food. The Voidstalkers fed on energy, but not just any kind of energy. They needed the complex electromagnetic patterns that only advanced civilizations could produce. The more sophisticated the technology, the more delicious the meal. Lee felt a pressure in his mind, like someone pressing gently against his thoughts. The psychic dampeners were supposed to protect the research team, but the creature was so powerful that some of its mental touch still got through. In that brief contact, he understood what it was feeling. Hunger. Incredible, ancient hunger that had lasted for millions of years. The creature had been drifting in the void between galaxies, sleeping and waiting, surviving on the tiny amounts of energy that leaked from distant stars. But now, it sensed something wonderful. The Velek siege fleet blazed in the creature's perception, like a feast beyond imagination. Hundreds of advanced starships, each one packed with fusion reactors, quantum computers, energy weapons, and force field generators. To the Voidstalker, the alien fleet looked like the largest banquet it had sensed in ages. It knows about the siege, Lee said quietly. It can feel their ships from here, across the entire solar system. Through the mental connection, Lee began to understand what these creatures really were. They were not just random monsters or simple predators. They were something far more frightening. They were gardeners for billions of years. The Voidstalkers had drifted through the galaxy, pruning away civilizations that grew too large, too advanced, too proud. They fed on the energy signatures of technological species, but they also served a purpose. They prevented any one civilization from becoming so powerful that it could dominate the entire galaxy. They were the reason why the galaxy was full of many different species, instead of being ruled by just one ancient empire. Whenever a civilization grew bright enough to attract their attention, the Voidstalkers would wake up and feed, then return to their long sleep until the next harvest was ready. Second containment bay is responding, Bay reported. And the third? They're all waking up. The research station held 37 Voidstalkers in total, each one captured during different deep space missions over the past 15 years. As they began to wake, Lee could feel their collective hunger growing stronger. They communicated with each other through methods that human science could not detect, sharing information about the rich feeding ground that had suddenly appeared in their territory. The Velek Consortium thought they were conquering a primitive world. They had no idea that they had just announced themselves as prey to the oldest hunters in the galaxy. Captain Park Seonho gripped the controls of his cargo ship as it drifted through the darkness beyond. Pluto, the Silent Dawn, had made this run to the outer research stations dozens of times, but never carrying cargo like this. His hands were steady on the controls, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air of the bridge. "Sensors clear," reported his navigator, Lieutenant Kim Soo-yang. "No Velek patrols in this sector. They're all focused on the inner system." The ship's manifest showed routine scientific supplies and equipment being transported from Research Station Erebus back toward Earth. Any Velek scanner would see nothing unusual. Just another desperate human attempt to evacuate their research data before the invasion began. But the reality was far different. In the cargo hold, 32 Voidstalkers moved like living shadows. They had been released from their containment cells just hours ago, and now they phased in and out of normal space as they prepared for their journey. The creatures could exist partially outside reality, which meant they could travel through the ship's hull without causing any damage. To Park, it felt like carrying 32 nuclear bombs that could think. "Captain," his engineer, Petty Officer Lee Jawan, called from his station. "I'm reading massive energy fluctuations from the cargo bay. Whatever those things are, they're drawing power from somewhere our instruments can't measure." Park nodded grimly. He had been briefed about the Voidstalkers, but seeing them in person was different from reading classified reports. The creatures were roughly the size of small shuttles, but their exact shape was impossible to determine. They seemed to absorb light itself, creating patches of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. When they moved, space around them rippled like water. "How long until we reach the inner system?" Park asked. 6 hours at current speed, Su Yang replied. "But sir, once we get closer to the Velok fleet, ... I know," Park said quietly. "We'll be flying directly into the largest concentration of enemy ships in human history. But that's exactly what these things want." Through the ship's internal sensors, Park could feel the Void Stalkers growing more active as they approached the Velok siege formation. The creatures were hunters, and they could sense their prey from incredible distances. The alien fleet blazed, in their perception, like a massive beacon, advertising the feast that waited ahead. On the bridge of the Velok flagship Dominion's Edge, Admiral Vorthok reviewed the final preparations for Earth's destruction. The siege platforms were in perfect position, their planet-killer weapons fully charged. In 18 hours, the human homeworld would be nothing but glowing debris. "Admiral," his sensor operator reported, "we're detecting some unusual quantum disturbances in the outer system. The signatures don't match any known human technology." Vorthok barely glanced at the readings. Probably some desperate scientific experiment. The humans know they're about to die. Let them waste their final hours on pointless research. The Velok had conquered 47 worlds using exactly this strategy. They had seen every possible response from desperate civilizations, suicide attacks, attempts to break the blockade, frantic diplomatic messages, even a few species that tried to use experimental weapons. None of it had ever worked. The consortium siege formations were simply too strong, but Vorthok had never faced an enemy that could exist partially outside normal space-time. The first Void Stalker reached the siege perimeter at exactly 0347 Galactic Standard Time. It had been traveling for 3 hours since leaving the Silent Dawn, moving through dimensions that Velok science could not detect. When it finally materialized near the heavy cruiser Steadfast Conquest, reality itself seemed to bend around its presence. Commander Jekyll was reviewing patrol schedules when his ship's alarms began screaming. "What's happening?" he demanded, rushing to the bridge. His tactical officer stared at his instruments in confusion. "Sir, something just appeared next to us, but it's not showing up on any of our scanners. It's like ... like space is broken." Through the main view screen, Jekyll saw something impossible. A patch of absolute darkness hung in space beside his ship, but it was not empty darkness. It moved and shifted, and wherever it touched, the stars behind it seemed to twist out of shape. "All weapons, target that ... thing," Jekyll ordered. But the Void Stalker was not interested in a fight. It was interested in food. The creature phased through the cruiser's shields as if they did not exist, then began to settle over the ship's hull like a living shadow. Where it touched the metal, energy began to flow. The Steadfast Conquest was a marvel of Velok engineering, powered by 3 fusion reactors, and equipped with enough weapons to level a city. All of that energy called to the Void Stalker like a banquet after millions of years of starvation. The creature began to feed, power levels dropping across all decks, reported the engineering officer, his voice rising in panic. "Fusion reactors, ARE, they're being drained, but not damaged, just emptied." Jekyll watched in horror as his ship's lights began to dim. The Void Stalker was not destroying the Steadfast Conquest. It was consuming everything that made the ship function. Weapons, engines, life support systems, even the electrical impulses in the crew's nervous systems, all became food for the ancient hunter. Within minutes, the proud warship was nothing but a hollow shell drifting in space. But the Void Stalker had gained something from its feast. The creature began to split, its dark form dividing into smaller pieces. Each piece grew and took shape, fed by the energy it had consumed. Where there had been one hunter, now there were three. The new void. Stalkers immediately began searching for their own prey. The Velek siege fleet stretched out before them like the largest buffet in galactic history. Hundreds of ships packed with delicious energy just waiting to be harvested. The hunt had begun. Lieutenant Colonel Yoon Daeho stood in the command center of Earth's primary defense station, watching screens that showed something no military strategist had ever planned for. The Velek fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours ago, was falling apart, ship by ship. But they were not being destroyed by human weapons or clever tactics. They were being eaten. "Sir, we've lost contact with another Velek cruiser," reported Sergeant Omin Seo from her tracking station. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she worked the controls. "That makes 12 ships in the past hour. They just... go dark." Yoon had been a soldier for 25 years. He had fought in 3 different wars and commanded troops in battles across 4 star systems. But he had never seen anything like this. The enemy fleet was not retreating or regrouping. They were being hunted by things that should not exist. On his main screen, thermal imaging showed the Void Stalkers moving between the Velek ships like sharks, circling wounded prey. The creatures appeared as patches of absolute cold against the heat signatures of the alien vessels. When a stalker approached a ship, the vessel's energy output would spike for a few minutes, then drop to 0 forever. "How many of those things are out there now?" Yoon asked. "Difficult to count," Sir Min Seo replied, checking her instruments. "They don't show up clearly on our sensors, but based on energy patterns, I'd estimate 63 distinct signatures. No, wait, 71. They keep multiplying. The mathematics of it were terrifying. Each time a Void Stalker consumed a ship, it gained enough energy to split into 2 or 3 new creatures. The alien fleet had hundreds of vessels, each one packed with fusion reactors, weapons systems, and advanced technology. Every ship that fell created more hunters across the solar system. The Velek commanders were finally beginning to understand what they faced. Admiral Vorthok stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching his perfectly organized siege formation crumble into chaos. His communications officer was receiving frantic messages from throughout the fleet. "Admiral, the thunder of victory has gone silent," the officer reported. "Also, the sharp blade and eternal might. We're losing contact with ships faster than we can track." Vorthok studied the tactical display, trying to make sense of the pattern. The attacking creatures seemed to prefer larger ships with more powerful energy sources. They ignored the smaller patrol vessels and went straight for the heavy cruisers and battleships. "What are our weapons doing against these things?" he demanded. "Nothing, sir," his tactical officer replied grimly. "Energy beams pass right through them. Missiles detonate without effect. It's like they're not entirely real." On the screen, Vorthok watched one of his best captains try desperately to save his ship. The captain had ordered all power to the shields and was firing every weapon at the dark shape that clung to his hull. But the Void Stalker ignored the attacks completely. It simply continued feeding until the mighty warship became an empty shell. "Sir," his communications officer said urgently, "I'm receiving a priority message from Fleet Command. They want to know our status." Vorthok opened his mouth to respond, but then stopped. What could he tell them? That the Velek Consortium's most powerful fleet was being destroyed by creatures that existed partly outside reality. That humanity had somehow allied themselves with monsters from the void between galaxies. He began to record his final report, knowing it would serve as a warning to other Velek forces. But as he spoke, he noticed something strange happening to his communications equipment. The signal was being intercepted, modified, replaced. The Void Stalkers had learned to mimic Velek technology. His warning would never reach its destination. Instead, false messages would be sent, telling Fleet Command that the siege was proceeding normally. The creatures were not just hunters. They were intelligent enough to prevent their prey from calling for help. On Research Station Erebus, Dr. Lee Minho was monitoring the battle from his laboratory when something touched his mind. It was not the gentle contact he had felt before, when the Void Stalkers were still contained. This was a powerful communication that bypassed all his psychic shields and spoke directly to his consciousness. The message came as pure concept rather than words. Gratitude. The creatures were grateful to humanity for providing them with the richest feast they had found in millions of years. But there was something else in the communication, something that made Lee's hands tremble as he understood its meaning. Recognition. The Void Stalkers would remember which species had awakened them and pointed them toward their prey. Humanity would be marked, protected, remembered as the gardeners who had helped tend the galaxy's growth. Lee realized that humanity had not just survived the Velic invasion. They had formed an alliance with beings that were older than most stars. The implications were staggering. Back on Earth's defense station, Yoon watched the final act of the battle unfold. The last few Velac ships were trying to retreat, but the Void Stalkers moved faster than anything bound by normal physics. One by one, the remaining vessels went dark. Sir Minseo reported, "I'm counting over 200 separate energy signatures. Now, the creatures have consumed the entire siege fleet." The massive platforms that had threatened to destroy Earth now drifted as empty monuments to alien arrogance. Between them, shadow creatures danced in patterns that human eyes could barely follow, celebrating their feast and growing stronger with each passing hour. The siege was over, but Yoon suspected that the real consequences were just beginning. Captain On-jun stared through the viewport of her exploration ship. New horizon at the dead world below. 8 months had passed since the Velic siege, and she was leading the first human expedition into what used to be Consortium space. The planet looked peaceful from orbit, its cities still intact, its lights still glowing softly in the darkness. But there was no one left alive down there. Life sign readings are 0 across all major population centers, reported her science officer, Lieutenant Nam Haijin. The infrastructure is completely functional. Power grids, transportation systems, even the orbital stations are still operating. But the people, they're just gone. On had seen 5 worlds like this in the past month. The Void Stalkers had spread far beyond Earth's solar system, following the energy trails left by Velic technology back to their home worlds. They had consumed entire civilizations, but they had done it cleanly. Cities remained standing, machines kept working, but every living being had simply vanished. Any sign of the Stalkers themselves? An asked. Negative, Captain, replied her tactical officer, Ensign Park Woo-sung. But we're detecting those strange quantum fluctuations in the outer system. They're definitely still here, just not visible to our sensors. The new horizon was part of a new fleet of human exploration vessels, all equipped with special transponders that marked them as friendly to the Void Stalkers. Dr. Lee Minho, now director of something called the Deep Watch, had developed the technology based on his research into how the creatures communicated. Every human ship now carried an invisible signature that told the Stalkers, "These are the ones who woke us up, who gave us the great feast. They are under our protection." Back on Earth, in a new research facility built in the ruins of Geneva, Dr. Lee monitored reports from across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. His screens showed a map of known space, with red dots marking civilizations that had gone silent in the past 8 months. There were hundreds of them. "The pattern is clear," he explained to his assistant, Dr. Jung Yan Woo, as they studied the latest data. The Stalkers follow power signatures and communication networks. Any civilization advanced enough to use subspace communications becomes a target. But the most disturbing discovery was how the Void Stalkers had evolved since their awakening. They were no longer simple predators that fed and moved on. Satellite observations showed them gathering in the empty spaces between star systems, organizing themselves into groups, communicating across vast distances. "They're building something," Lee said quietly, pointing to a sensor reading from the Andromeda sector. "Structures that exist partially outside our dimension. They're not just hunters anymore. They've become gardeners." The implications were terrifying and fascinating. The Void Stalkers were tending the galaxy like a vast farm, removing civilizations that grew too large or too advanced, keeping the balance of power from tipping too far in any direction. They had been doing this for millions of years, Lee realized. That was why the galaxy was full of many different species, instead of being dominated by one. Ancient Empire. On the frontier world of New Kyoto, Colonial Administrator Shin Nara was dealing with a very different problem. Human expansion had accelerated dramatically since the Velux siege. With dozens of empty worlds suddenly available, families and corporations were rushing to claim new territories. "We have settlement requests for 17 more systems," her aide, Kim Min-seok, reported. "All former Velux colonies. The planets are in perfect condition, just ... empty." It was strange, Nara thought, how quickly humans had adapted to living on worlds where entire civilizations had recently vanished. The empty cities were cleaned out and repurposed, the infrastructure was updated with human technology, and life went on. It felt wrong somehow, but the alternative was to let perfectly good worlds sit unused. "Any word from the survey teams in the Outer Rim?" she asked. "That's the interesting part," Min-seok replied. "They've made contact with a new species, called the Krathan hegemony. Apparently, they're expanding in our direction and aren't happy about human presence in former Velux space." 3 weeks later, the first Krathan warships arrived at the edge of human space. They were impressive vessels, larger than anything in Earth's fleet, armed with weapons that could shatter moons. Their message was simple: humans would withdraw from Krathan territory or face the consequences. Admiral Kim Taeyong, commander of Earth's Third Fleet, received the ultimatum with surprising calm. "Send them our standard response," he ordered. "Tell them we're willing to negotiate territorial boundaries through diplomatic channels." But the Krathan were not interested in diplomacy. They wanted the rich worlds that humanity had claimed, and they were willing to fight for them. Their fleet moved deeper into human space, confident in their superior technology. They lasted exactly 17 hours. The Void Stalkers detected the Krathan energy signatures long before the alien ships reached any human colonies. To the ancient hunters, the Krathan fleet looked like another delicious feast, bright with the electromagnetic patterns of advanced technology. By the time the Krathan realized what was happening, it was too late. Their shields could not stop creatures that existed partially outside reality. Their weapons could not hit targets that moved between dimensions. One by one, their mighty ships went dark, consumed by shadows that fed on starlight itself. The few survivors who escaped spread the word. Throughout the galaxy, humanity was under the protection of beings older than most stars, creatures that treated entire sectors of space like hunting preserves. Other species began to understand the new reality. Humans could go anywhere, settle any world, expand without limit. They walked under the protection of nightmares that waited patiently in the darkness between worlds, always hungry for the next civilization that grew too bright, too proud, too threatening to the species they had chosen to protect. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about making enemies of those who befriend monsters.